I still remember the exact moment I pulled up to the street where my mother's house once stood, expecting to see the familiar red brick bungalow with the slightly crooked mailbox, the garden gnome she insisted on naming Jeremiah, and the pale blue shutters she painted every spring. What greeted me instead was a smooth-over expanse of fresh concrete, caution tape, a towering pile of lumber, and a garish sign that read, "Future site of Crest Meadow HOA Community Pool, coming summer 2025. My mouth went dry before I even got out of the car, a weird, surreal fog pressing against my skull as I stepped onto the curb, the ground under me no longer familiar but desecrated, as if someone had paved over my childhood itself. There was no mistake. This was the lot. This was where my mother's house had stood for over 40 years, paid in full, passed down through my grandparents, the first property our family ever owned free and clear. I stared at the site for what felt like a lifetime before the shock gave way to a strange, cold fury, the kind that creeps in when something violates the sanctity of home, memory, and bloodline all at once. A contractor in a reflective vest noticed me and gave a casual wave, like I was just some passerby. I walked up to him and asked slowly, carefully, what happened to the house that was here. He looked at a clipboard, squinted, and then said, "Oh, you mean the old abandoned house? Yeah, HOA greenlit the demo last week, something about code violations and it being vacant." My fingers clenched. "It wasn't abandoned," I said, my voice sharp. "My mother lived there. She was at her sister's for 2 weeks recovering from surgery." "Who authorized this?" He shrugged, already turning away. "Talk to the HO, not me. I just do what's on the paperwork." I walked the perimeter like a mourner circling a gravesite, heart pounding. Gone. Everything, my mother's old piano, her vintage bookshelf, the watercolor paintings she never let go of, even though they were faded and crooked, all of it reduced to dust. My mother had no idea yet. She would be home in 2 days, expecting to walk into her living room and see her cat, Muffin, asleep on the armrest. And instead, there would be nothing. The weight of that realization made my vision blur with rage and helplessness. Crest Meadow, I'd heard their name before, just murmurs, whispers from residents complaining about fines, about overreach, about intimidation tactics wrapped in bureaucratic language. But this was beyond overreach. This was annihilation. And the worst part, I had received no notice. My mother had received no notice. Nothing was served, nothing was signed, and I, her son, her legal counsel, the damn district attorney for this county, had been blindsided like a civilian. I took pictures. I recorded video. I flagged the contractor's license plate, and I went home trembling but calculating. That night, my mother called just to check in, chirping with gratitude about how nice her sister was treating her, blissfully unaware that her entire life had been raised in her absence. I couldn't bring myself to tell her over the phone. I told her to stay another week. I'd handle things, I said, keeping my tone light, making excuses. And then I dug in. I accessed county property records, looking for demo permits, title transfers, inspection orders. There were none. Nothing filed, nothing legal. A private association had made an executive decision to destroy private property, and I was going to find out who signed off, who profited, and who needed to pay. Because this wasn't just a mistake. It was a crime, and they had no idea who they had just bulldozed into war with. The next morning, I was already 10 steps ahead of them. I skipped the anger, skipped the chest puffing, and went straight into lawyer mode, measured, meticulous, and methodical. Before dawn, I sent a records request to the county office, knowing full well they'd find nothing filed for demolition, because I'd already looked the night before, and it didn't exist. The next step was identifying the power players within the HOA. Crest Meadow was one of those neighborhoods with a rotating board, but there were always a few familiar names clinging to power like ticks on a dog. Harold Dunstan, president; Karen Albrecht, secretary and treasurer; and Joel Ramirez, who everyone hated but no one could get rid of because he knew the bylaws better than anyone else. I compiled a dossier on each of them, legal and otherwise. Harold, a former real estate agent with a string of ethics complaints. Karen, a retired accountant with a taste for control. Joel, a litigation-happy parasite who once sued a neighbor for trimming a hedge too aggressively. I attended the next HOA meeting, careful to sit in the back and wear something forgettable: baseball cap, hoodie, silent scowl. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, ironically a building paid for by outrageous resident dues, and when I walked in, I immediately saw a large printed poster of the same sign that now stood on my mother's graveyard: future site of Crest Meadow HOA Community Pool. There were snacks, laughter, idle chatter about flower beds and dog waste, until the meeting came to order, and Harold took the mic like he was emceeing a town hall instead of presiding over one of the most abusive microgovernments I'd ever encountered. They went through the usual motions, board minutes, landscaping contracts, and then they got to new developments. That's when Harold beamed and said, "Demolition was successful. We're ahead of schedule. The pool will bring property values up across the board." My fists clenched under the table. I raised my hand. He nodded toward me like I was nobody, and I stood. "What property was demolished?" I asked, deadpan. "Which house?" Harold squinted. "Oh, I believe it was 1147 Brookhaven. Been vacant for a while. Owner was non-responsive." A couple people nodded. "That's funny," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Because 1147 Brookhaven belonged to my mother, who was out of town for surgery. And I don't recall any demolition permits being filed with the county." The room fell dead silent. Harold blinked. "Well, that's a legal matter. If she wants to contest, she can file something with." "She won't be filing anything," I said, stepping forward. "Because I'm her legal counsel. And I'm the sitting district attorney of this county." Gasps followed. Karen dropped her pen. Joel looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. I took out a folder and placed it on the table in front of them, the top sheet showing a photo of my mother's leveled home. "You had no authority, no court order, no municipal green light. You acted based on your internal vote and a fraudulent claim of vacancy. That is criminal trespass, unlawful destruction of private property, and you better believe I'm going to uncover everything you've buried." Harold stammered, then tried to regain footing. "Now, hold on. This was all in the interest of the community. The home was deteriorating. I visited it 3 days before the bulldozers did," I snapped. "It was in perfect condition. Your contractor used a master key to gain entry. Someone from your board gave that key." Joel finally spoke. "We acted under emergency code enforcement powers outlined in the bylaws. It's all there." "Your bylaws are not law," I said. "They're guidelines. They don't supersede the Constitution, or civil property code, or due process, or human decency." People in the crowd began murmuring. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked terrified. I locked eyes with Harold. "You destroyed a home that had been in my family for 3 generations. You didn't check tax rolls. You didn't knock. You didn't notify. And now you're going to be under investigation by the very office I run." Karen tried to interrupt, something about a miscommunication, but I wasn't listening. I turned to the room. "If anyone here feels this was acceptable behavior, I suggest you leave now, because the fallout is going to be very public, very legal, and very permanent." I gathered my things and left before they could respond, their stunned silence ringing behind me like a funeral bell. Outside, the sun had dipped low behind the trees, and the once pristine neighborhood felt like a set piece in a crime drama, because it was. And I had just entered the opening act. That night, I filed a formal request for every document Crest Meadow HOA had submitted in the past 12 months. I subpoenaed their meeting transcripts. I opened a file on each of the board members and began drafting preliminary charges. It would be methodical, thorough, and slow, like watching a snake coil tighter and tighter around its prey. They thought they were untouchable. They thought they could erase a woman's life because they wanted a summer pool. And now they were about to learn exactly what happens when you bulldoze the wrong family. The first headline hit the local news within 72 hours. District Attorney opens criminal investigation into Crest Meadow HOA after unauthorized demolition. The photo accompanying the article was of me standing in front of the rubble, jaw clenched, arms folded, the destruction behind me a perfect portrait of institutional failure, and now accountability. I didn't need to leak the story. Reporters were already circling the site after seeing construction crews on a residential lot with no permits visible. I simply gave them a quote, calm but direct, that HOA cannot destroy private property because it feels entitled to it. That's not governance. That's criminal behavior. Within days, my office was flooded with tips, residents anonymously sending emails, documents, even video footage. Turns out, the bulldozing of my mother's home wasn't an isolated misstep. It was the culmination of a long pattern of power abuse. One neighbor told us that Karen had threatened to fine her $500 a day for having a non-regulation mailbox. Another described how Joel forced a retired couple to remove solar panels because they were unsightly, despite state law allowing them. Most damning was a former HOA secretary who came forward and handed me a flash drive. On it were archived emails between board members, casual, smug, arrogant discussions about fast-tracking certain properties for community benefit, especially those belonging to elderly or absent residents who wouldn't make a fuss. My mother's name was on that list. So was her address. The emails showed Joel suggesting they mark the house vacant in official meeting notes, and Harold replying, "Do it. If we get pushback, we'll just blame the contractor." That broke something in me. Not because they lied, but because they planned it. Coldly. Strategically. Like it was a game. My office filed charges within the week. Felony destruction of private property, conspiracy to commit fraud, trespassing, and abuse of power under color of authority. The subpoenas followed. The court appearances were scheduled. Crest Meadow HOA hired a crisis PR firm, but it was too late. The story had gone statewide. Bigger news outlets picked it up, and soon I was doing interviews, not just as a grieving son, but as a prosecutor pulling back the curtain on one of the most corrupt HOAs in the state. Residents began attending board meetings in protest, holding signs that read "Justice for 1147 Brookhaven" and "We're next." The media covered the hearings like it was a celebrity trial. And every day, more evidence emerged. Financial records showed the HOA had been skimming off the top of resident dues to fund unauthorized projects, including the pool, which had no real budget plan beyond Harold's pipe dream of increasing property values. When we confronted Karen about the missing $48,000 in discretionary funds, she pled the fifth. Joel refused to speak entirely, citing legal counsel. But Harold cracked. In a deposition, sweating bullets and stammering, he admitted they had voted in a closed session, an illegal move under HOA transparency laws, and had relied on Joel's assurance that they could claim implied vacancy under an obscure clause. My legal team laughed when they read it. There's no such thing. The clause Joel cited was actually taken from a defunct HOA guidebook published in 1996, never adopted, never ratified, and never recognized by the state. With every week, the house of cards fell further. Contractors began returning money under threat of license suspension. One developer backed out of a future deal. We saw his name in a preliminary investigative report. And the residents, finally awakened from the fog of fear, began organizing. A new faction formed, Restore Crest Meadow. They petitioned for a vote of no confidence, and with enough signatures, forced a special election. But the real blow came when we filed a civil lawsuit on top of the criminal charges. $1.2 million in damages, emotional, financial, historical. The home was more than wood and paint. It was a cornerstone of family, a neighborhood legacy, and it had been erased. My mother still hadn't seen the site. I kept her with her sister, shielding her from the chaos while I dismantled the empire that had dared to touch what was hers. Every time I entered the courtroom, I wore the same tie my father had worn when he signed the deed with my grandfather. Symbolic? Maybe. But I believed in symbols. Just like I believed in consequences. The kind you feel for years, in reputation, in restitution, in the history books. Because this wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was about showing every HOA across the country that their power wasn't absolute. That laws still mattered. That people still mattered. And that if you mess with the wrong family, if you bulldoze the wrong house, there's a reckoning waiting on the other side. And this was only the beginning. It was exactly 41 days after the demolition that I brought my mother back to what was once 1147 Brookhaven. I had delayed it as long as I could, insulating her from the images, from the footage, from the screaming headlines that now made our name infamous across the state. But she was ready, or at least she needed to be. We pulled up in silence, her hand gently gripping mine across the center console, trembling like it did after her surgeries. The lot was quiet now. No more lumber stacks. No bulldozers. No signs. Just emptiness, a wound in the middle of a street lined with still-standing homes, most of which had hastily removed their HOA stickers from the windows. She stepped out slowly, holding on to me, and when her eyes landed on the flattened earth, she didn't cry. She just nodded, like she'd already made peace with it in some unseen way. "It's not the house that made the memories," she said softly. "It was us." I told her everything, about the emails, the vote, the criminal charges. Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't interrupt once. "And what happens to them now?" she asked. "They lose everything," I said. And it was true. 2 days earlier, the court handed down its verdict. Harold Dunstan was found guilty on multiple counts: conspiracy, unlawful demolition, abuse of power, and sentenced to 6 years in state prison with no possibility of early release due to aggravated fraud. Karen Albrecht took a plea deal, agreeing to testify against the others in exchange for 2 years house arrest and permanent banishment from any future HOA leadership role anywhere in the country. Joel Ramirez fought until the end, smug and arrogant, but the jury came back with a unanimous conviction. He received 5 years and a $250,000 personal restitution order, which would go directly to my mother. And the HOA itself? Disbanded. By court order. Crest Meadow is now under the supervision of a court-appointed property manager until a neighborhood can reorganize itself under a voluntary civic association with zero legal enforcement power. Every homeowner was given the option to reclaim their dues from the past 2 years, and many did. The HOA's bank accounts were drained by court fees, settlements, and fines. What remained of its reputation was buried in public disgrace. The pool project was scrapped. The contractor lost his license. The PR firm stopped responding. And in place of a summer oasis, the community voted to dedicate the lot to my mother. With her permission, we designed a memorial garden, native plants, a winding stone path, and small bronze plaque at the edge that reads, "This ground once held home." Let it always remind us what should never be destroyed. But that wasn't enough for me. I used my influence, my platform, and my fury to push forward legislation at the state level, the Brookhaven Protection Act, which would require all HOAs to obtain a judicial review before any action that involves property seizure, demolition, or forced sale. It passed unanimously. The governor signed it with my mother standing beside him. She cried then. We both did. Not for what was lost, but for what couldn't be taken from us. Our voice, our fight, our damn name. Rebuilding took time. We didn't reconstruct the house exactly as it was. We built better. Same lot, new foundation, solar-powered, storm-resistant, and designed with wide halls and custom handrails so she'd never struggle to move through it again. We used part of the settlement funds and donations that came in from strangers across the country, people who saw our story and decided to send $50 or a letter or a photograph of their own demolished memories. I answered everyone. I told them their stories mattered, that they weren't alone. Because this was never just about bricks. It was about the sickness of unchecked authority and what it means to stand against it with nothing but the truth in one hand and fire in the other. In the fall, on the day we moved her back in, I stood on the porch alone for a few minutes, letting the morning air wrap around me like an old coat. Everything had changed, and yet somehow nothing had. Birds still chirped. The mail still came. Somewhere down the road, some HOA board would no doubt try something crooked again. But now there'd be a law, a precedent, a name they'd remember when they thought they could get away with it. I smiled, then turned back inside to find my mother placing Jeremiah the gnome by the front steps again, his paint retouched, his smile unchanged. Home rebuilt. Justice done. And a message left in concrete and stone. You don't bulldoze a legacy and walk away clean. Not on my watch.